Now I wanted to talk about government stimulus. Now, I don't want to cover it comprehensively, but what I do want to address is the idea that by stimulating or by getting um, either factories or other capital goods or whatever to produce more, that this is desirable or inherently good or proof that stimulus is beneficial. Um, I think the problem with that position, with that argument, is that it assumes that um, a greater quantity of a good is necessarily good or an improvement. And I think it's very obvious that this is not the case. Some of the more common ones would be like, say, the uh, blacksmith or horseshoe industry during the rise of automobiles. It's quite conceivable that they could approach the government and say, our horseshoe factories are underproducing. They have a capacity that they could produce a lot more, and they're not, because obviously people are buying fewer of them, and the government could pay them. I mean, the government could go and say, well, we'll just buy, however many horseshoes you're buying, we'll buy twice as many. And they would begin to produce more, but that wouldn't be a good thing. There's only a limited amount of labor, there's only a limited amount of iron ore, there's only a limited amount of time, and it would be wasted producing something that nobody wants or needs, or perhaps they might need, but they don't value it enough to actually cover the cost. And so it's a tremendous waste. And it's not just antiquated goods, it's any good beyond the quantity that is demanded. So even if it's not horseshoes, even if it's something people like automobiles. We still use automobiles, but that doesn't mean that our demand for them is infinite. That doesn't mean that we always want or need another one. And so to simply have GM or whoever keep producing them, if people don't demand them, then you're wasting those resources. Those resources would be better applied someplace else. And the thing with government stimulus is it necessarily will be picking industries. I mean, even if you did it across the board and you somehow had a way, which is, I've never heard of a convincing way to do this, but if you could have the stimulus be evenly distributed either to every firm or to every person, it still would be a misallocation, because there are some firms that are on the edge of not being profitable, of not having, not suiting customer demands, and they could be propped up in this way. So there's no basis for just assuming that an increase in production is necessarily a good thing. If nobody wants what's being produced, then it's not a good thing. And to be perfectly frank, it's a bad thing, because it's wasting resources and time and labor. Like one example I read about recently was anthracite coal. Anthracite coal is a particular type of coal. I guess it's a high sulfur content, and it's mined primarily in northeast Pennsylvania, and it peaked in employment in about 1914, and ever since then there's been a decline in the number of laborers, because other types of coal and other types of energy are preferred by customers, and so gradually it was growing less and less. Well, in the 60s, the 4 congressmen from this area basically had a great idea, and they basically had the military begin buying this anthracite coal. And I don't know, basically the government was paying twice as much. They doubled the amount of coal that was produced there. But we got to the point eventually by the 90s where it wasn't even legal to burn this stuff. And the government was buying it, miners were mining it, workers were working full-time shifts, full-time employed, and they're taking this anthracite coal and then They just put it in giant piles, slag heaps, because it couldn't even be burned. Nobody wanted, even they couldn't even give it away. I don't know how anybody could look at that and say that's a good thing. That's stimulus. The anthracite coal industry was stimulated. It would be far better if, instead of working days and nights to produce a product that nobody wants, that is simply piled into a huge pile, where it will probably be degraded anyway because it's an outdoor pile. Those workers have to have gone and switched to a new line of work, producing something that people actually want and are willing to pay for. So, and all the machine tools, all the cranes and bulldozers and drills and all the dynamite that they use and all the railroad capacity and all that stuff wasted, stimulated. I worked at a Krispy Kreme for a couple of years, and Krispy Kreme is like a donut factory. It's a big machine, and there's an assembly line. And the maximum I could make was 270 dozen per hour. And when we were busy, I was expected to actually make about that many. But we would only be busy for a few hours a day, and if I kept up that rate for my entire shift, we would end up throwing away tens of thousands of donuts a day that we just couldn't sell. And the thing is there are only 2 shifts. A Keynesian, a stimulator out there would look at that and say, why do we have this undercapacity? You used to just run the machine 24/7, even though we won't sell any donuts at 2 a.m., even if we are open. Now, the fact that we would be wasting probably a ton of flour a day, not to mention sugar and electricity and labor, I don't see how that couldn't strike. That strikes me as enormously wasteful. Not every capital good, requires to be in operation constantly. If you can get it to the point where you're meeting consumer demands and it's working constantly, then that is efficient. Because if you have stuff that's idle all the time, that's not good. But some industries, that's a requirement. If you have like an almond farm or some other kind of orchard, you can't have that producing all the time. That only produces, in season, and you can't just switch it to making something else during the rest of the year. So should we chop down all the orchards because they only produce, for a few months out of the year for 1 quarter? Or every factory that closes for the night that doesn't have a 3rd shift, and on and on and on. How they should be allocated should not be based on politics. It should be based on consumer demands. Consumers aren't demanding very much, then they'll go out of business. If they demand more, they'll probably open another shift. And the thing is some might argue, well, maybe hypothetically there's a way that an altruistic, omniscient government would be able to do this, but come on, let's be honest. The government will stimulate for political ends. It'll stimulate in the states that they think are swing states. Both under FDR and under Obama, most of the stimulus packages were spent in swing states, not in places where either are sure to go Republican or sure to go Democrat. During the Great Depression, the poorest states were in the South, Mississippi, Alabama. No dispute about that. They didn't get hardly any help, so to speak, because they were the solid South. They voted Democrat. They went to places like Ohio or Michigan or Tennessee, places where there was some question as to how the states would go electorally. So, I don't think that politicians are omniscient. I don't think that it's even possible. But to premise, well, hypothetically it could work if they were altruistic or whatever. They're not, so I don't know why. Be like me saying, I could have my dog do my grocery shopping for me. As long as my dog suddenly had hands and was intelligent as a human. Yeah, I guess, but since that's not the way my dog is, that's not how any dog is, there's no way to make a dog that way. Coming up with a plan based on that set of circumstances seems silly. I don't know why people bother. And this isn't, I mean, theoretically there are reasons why the state's incentivized to fail or whatever. And I really like those arguments. But, you know, my main interest is history, and history is basically empiricism applied to the state. And we know that states don't act, they act in the interests of whoever is in control of the apparatus of the state, whether that be a king, whether that be a cadre of elected officials, or a bureaucracy, or some general, or whoever. And they never operate, ever, in the interests of other than that. So, I guess that's a little off topic, but the stimulus that the government gives is destructive and wasteful, and it prevents rational allocation, or in some cases reallocation of resources. And I'm sorry to see that some people have failed to realize this, but I guess it's not that surprising given that much of that resource allocation is dedicated towards media and higher education, and so the government spends a lot of money to make sure it has gets its case out there, so to speak.